Thank you, Sydney. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are having a session about humanitarian aid and missionary work. And my name is Winnie. I'm part of the No White Saviors team. Thank you for making time to join this. Thank you for purchasing tickets. Thank you for your continued support. And we look forward to an interactive session. So with that being said, I'll leave the floor to the rest of the No White Saviors members and Sydney herself at the end.
So Wendy is driving right now. Wendy, please feel free to. Oh,
I'm not really driving.
Okay.
I'm parked somewhere just to have this call because I can't make it home, or else I'll be, borders and all those other things. But yay, hi, my name's Wendy Lubega Namatov, a team member at the No White Saviors. I'm happy to be here. I saw a few people I'm familiar with joining. I saw Sarah Nell. Hi, Sarah Nell. I'm not sure if it's the Ania that I know, but the name is quite familiar. Thank you for joining us today.
Rothomio, if you want to go first, and then I'll go after.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Rothomio Gabriel Kabandole Arati, a team member of the No White Saviors, and I'm glad to be here with you all today.
Awesome. I'm Kelsey Nielsen. I am from Philly, live in Kampala, get to work with this badass team. We are all very, very different, from very different backgrounds, different personalities, but we all share a very similar common goal of drastically changing the way that missionary development and humanitarian work looks here. But there's so much that has grown beyond that since the inception of No White Saviors. So we also have an NGO called Akusi Mama Africa, which we won't get so deep into, but if you ever want more information on that, we're happy to share. But that's the grassroots work we're able to do on the ground through hosting conversations like this with the wonderful Sydney. So welcome, we're happy to be here as a collective. Olivia would have been on, but she's feeling a bit under the weather. But hopefully for the next session, she will be joining us for part 2. So with that, we'd love for Sydney to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. And again, welcome everyone who is joining us from around the world, whether you are stateside, on the continent, or somewhere in Europe, or even beyond Europe, in Asia, Africa, all of the spaces. We welcome all of you into this space with us. And like Kelsey said, my name is Sydney Rose. I am a historian and Afrofuturist. Those of you that are familiar with that term will know that that is someone who is very much engaged in reimagining Black existence outside of racism and outside of white supremacy. A lot of my work as a historian is rooted not only in looking at our past, but also understanding how that past dictates our lived experiences in the present, and also what that means for us going forward. Those of you who are engaged in social activism, particularly when it comes to white-centric spaces, you'll know that when we talk about decolonization, what we're really discussing is how are our philosophies, policies, and day-to-day practices harming those in our community and beyond our community as well. So as we go through this space today, know that this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. Anyone who is familiar with No White Saviors will know that we are all about uncomfortable conversations, because we cannot come to the table if we don't first understand what table we're coming to. And these are uncomfortable tables that we're forming, because we have to understand both the history and the lived experience that we exist in right now. Now, like many Black Americans and Black folks that are part of the diaspora, my family's history is one of exploitation, of displacement, and of dehumanization. But it is also a story of resilience and resistance. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, when we talk about the Middle Passage, we're not only talking about that multi-generational trauma that is attached to this time in our history, our shared history. We are also talking about a story of resilience and a story of resistance that did not start in 1619, but started far before then and is continuing to today. So as we come into this space, I do encourage all of you to keep in mind that we're not only talking about history, we're talking about memories, lived experiences that are still touching people to this day. And this is something that is uncomfortable. And for those of you that are engaged in humanitarian work, it's important to know that we're talking about systems that we are actively a part of. But before we get into the meat and green things of that discussion, I wanted to share with you all a little bit of a breakdown of what we'll actually be diving into today. Because when we talk about the term white supremacy, we come up with 50 different definitions, which are all valid and all share space because white supremacy is something that infects and affects all of us. But it can be a little bit confusing when we talk about it because it is something that is very wide sweeping, and it's something that's very important for all of us to understand in our day-to-day lives. So when we talk about white supremacy here in this shared community space, what we really have to think of is breaking it down into 3 specific sections. This is what I like to call the 3 Ps of white supremacy. And actually, I'll be sharing with you all a little breakdown for those of you who are visual learners so that we can all dive right into it. So when we talk about the 3 Ps of white supremacy, what we're really diving into is what is the philosophy of white supremacy, what are the policies of white supremacy, and what are the day-to-day practices of white supremacy. Now, when we think about what is the philosophy of white supremacy, what we're really discussing is how does white supremacy manifest as a philosophy, as an idea? And what it is the belief that white identities, white cultures, white histories, and the economic, social, and gender constructs that are built by and for white people are naturally or by merit superior to non-white peoples, cultures, ideologies, lived experiences, and communities. Now that's a whole lot right there, but we'll break it down for y'all. So what that means as a philosophy is really rooted in this sense that people who are racialized as white or come from cultures that identify as Eurocentric or white cultures, and everything that is attached to that white-centric culture, whether that is history, whether that is a biomythology, the identity and the words and labels that you attach to yourself, all of that is considered superior to non-white peoples. Now, again, some of you might be saying, well, I'm not racist or I'm not a white supremacist because I don't think white people are inherently or by merit superior to non-white people. But what we have to remember again is that we are all infected and affected by white supremacy. So whether or not we are actively racist or card-carrying Ku Klux Klan members, we are all attached to this system because it impacts our politics, and our politics reinforce our day-to-day practices. So with that in mind, when we think about how this philosophy permeates our policies and our politics, what we really have to think about is how does this philosophy of white supremacy turn into actual politics and actual policy making decisions. Now, on some levels, that includes very wide sweeping politics, things that are similar to settler colonialism and apartheid states, but also in our intimate local politics as well. So, for example, here in the United States, a lot of folks might not think of gentrification as being necessarily racist. They'll just say, oh, well, that's a city policy or that's a state policy. But gentrification, which is the push out of communities, particularly communities of color, and in the United States, especially Black communities of color, being pushed out of their communities, which are then flipped and renovated and spruced up and made into high-end communities. Now, how that is rooted in settler colonialism is very much about how is it manifesting in that community space. They are literally pushing out people of color who are not going to benefit from any of these new renovations because they've been pushed out, their houses have been sold or torn down and turned into high-end places. So when we think about our nice, spunky, cool, swanky neighborhoods, all of the new hipster districts that are in our community spaces, we have to remember, are we moving into those gentrified communities? So are we actively participating, or even as parents or as community adults, when we talk about, oh, we want our children to go to good school districts, we have to pause and think about what are the non-good school districts and what are the demographics of those schools. It's typically Black and brown schools or schools that have a larger population of Black and brown students. So again, the language that we are using in our day-to-day lives is all dictated by the politics that are around us. And those politics are influenced by the philosophy of white supremacy. So again, when we are talking about how we are infected and affected by whiteness, it goes down to our day-to-day existence. How are we moving through these spaces? Where are we deciding to live? How are we deciding to engage? And again, what workspaces are we looking to influence and be a part of? And so today, when we're talking about humanitarian aid, that's where we're starting off, is again, how are we looking at white supremacy manifesting in this type of community space? Now, with that little breakdown, we're going to go right into the discussion for today, which again is about humanitarian aid. But first, we're going to talk about one specific aspect of humanitarian aid, what has to do with the anti-Black refugee crisis that has been manifesting across our globe for a number of years, in fact, a number of decades. So in the past few weeks, we have seen various news outlets across the global north, that is to say, countries that are wealthier in our world, particularly in the Americas and in Europe and in parts of Asia as well. These news agencies have been normalizing the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous rhetoric of white supremacy and religious imperialism, and this biomythology of the great European race in relation to the refugees of Ukraine, who we should not have to note include Afro and Black Ukrainians, Asian Ukrainians, and Turkic peoples and Indigenous folks from across Eastern Europe. So when we talk about how these news stations are saying, oh, well, the reason we're helping Ukraine is because they're a Christian country, or they're part of Europe, or they're not a third world country. Again, this is very anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and especially anti-Muslim rhetoric that is being normalized on these global news stations like the BBC and like CNN, amongst others. So when we talk about anti-Blackness, again, it's not just politics that are being created. It's all about the philosophy and how that philosophy permeates the rest of our existence. So with the No White Saviors team, we're really going to be discussing how does that white-centric mythology normalize the harm and dehumanization of communities of color across the global South, and specifically those who exist in African and Middle Eastern spaces as well. So our team, I think it was Barthomeo who was going to share some of his thoughts as well.
Yes, Sydney. I think a week or a couple of days ago, we put out a tweet that basically states that how far off from being racially white decides your fate or has an impact on your fate. What we see happening in Ukraine at the border is very heartbreaking. And then to see the anti-Blackness occur, I would say it's not surprising, because throughout history, I've found that whenever there's conflict, there's always space for anti-Black racism. Anti-Blackness within most communities doesn't take a break. It's always doing its job. You'll find that the response that has been put out by Europe, that has been put out by America, the United States of America, is very hypocritical. Just a few years ago, there was a quote-unquote immigration crisis which was termed by Europe an immigration crisis that involved over 1.4 million refugees from both Africa and the Middle East. And you saw the media reporting on this, about how it would lead to a decline in Europe's civilization, and how these foreign entities would come in and quote unquote contaminate their way of living. They would come and steal their jobs. Basically the same rhetoric that always goes around. And it's only now when you see the response, in contrast, the response given to 2 million refugees from the nation of Ukraine, that you see there's a double standard. Why is it, and you have to ask yourself, why is it that if 1.4 million Black and brown refugees is considered a crisis, then what would that make 2 million refugees? When you look at the fact that a lot of these media groups have freely, actually not even freely, but they have quote unquote have had to choose their words wisely as they spew anti-Blackness, as they spew anti-Middle Eastern rhetoric. And I remember there's one individual who talked about how the Ukrainians, people like them, they have quote unquote Netflix. They go to cafes, they do all this. I also do all this. I canceled my Netflix account, but I still had Netflix. So what does that make me? Am I not human? Additionally, even the response by the Ukrainian authorities at the border was heartbreaking, because in a time of conflict, everyone has a right to seek refuge. And you often prioritize groups that are susceptible to more harm. And in this case, you find it's children, right? And women are often those that are prioritized. So for the authorities, whether they were acting out on an individual basis or by orders, it still doesn't mitigate what was done. When you find that they were literally refusing Black women and children, Indian women and children, Arab women and children from boarding, and yet they had earlier on mentioned only women and children allowed. What does that show you? That it is a selectiveness for those racially viewed as white, that the white supremacy doesn't take a break, that the double standards will always exist no matter where the conflict is. I'm not sure if either of my team members can find an article on this, but in the previous century, there existed Polish refugees in Uganda. right? And they had a home here. They weren't, I don't think they were marginalized by the society here. I don't think they were exploited by the society. Rather, they were welcomed. And you find that African countries or countries in the global south actually do have a better record of caring for all individuals, regardless of origin, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of race, because we understand it's a bare minimum thing to do, that everybody has the right, that even though this are a demographic from people who have harmed you, the least you can give them is respect, because they're at a point of pain, that we understand your pain. And I remember we even put out a post on our stories about having not even to explain, but to let people know that we are not spewing anti-Ukrainian rhetoric by highlighting the anti-Blackness, but rather we are indifferent to their suffering because we understand what it means to have your home taken away. But that doesn't give someone a right to be anti-Black. You have people talking about how they aren't used to war. War is something that is foreign to the European continent. The last time I did my mathematics, most of the biggest conflicts have been fought on that continent. The last time I did my research, it was just recently where, I think it was in Serbia, if I'm not mistaken, but there was an ethnic cleansing, a genocide happened. So, and even someone has written here, Anya, about how quick it has been to sanction Russia. I think it took them 5 days, if I'm not mistaken, to sanction Russia. But on the very same day that Russia invaded Ukraine, the US bombed Somalia. The US bombed Yemen. Israel bombed Syria, if I'm not mistaken. So where is the equity in this? I don't know if any of my team members has something to add.
No, I think you're right there on the money, especially because I think in the last, 3 weeks now, there's been so much support that's been poured into Ukraine. And in some ways, especially because we're in the midst of this global pandemic, and if you are a student of history, you'll know that a lot of pandemics that are on the global scale, afterwards, there's this call to action to reimagine our societies and the way that we engage with each other and support each other, especially when it comes to resource sharing. But think about all that has happened in the last 2 years, especially around trying to support communities of color, especially Black and Brown communities of color in the United States and beyond, those communities that are in these global North spaces, and how, yes, everybody was out protesting on the streets for about a month and a half, and then everybody went home and kind of the momentum kind of burnt out. And of course, organizers and community bridge builders were still out here doing the work, but there were a number of people that just kind of stopped talking about it. And I know and we've talked about this in our discussions with Mio and Kelsey as well, just about how there's this almost performative nature around activism when it comes to Black and Brown communities. But with Ukraine, I know people in my own community that said, we have an extra room, our kids are in college, so we have space down here in Florida. If you're following the news right now, Florida's kind of on fire politically, but the fact that people are willing to go this extra mile for Ukraine, where they wouldn't extend that same grace to their own neighbors, to the own Black and Brown people in their communities, which of course, what is happening in Ukraine deserves our investment and our encouragement, especially for people that are trying to flee. But just because, and Barthomeo, I think you said this so profoundly, that we can care about Ukraine, but not dismiss everything that is happening in Africa and across the global North with communities of color. And I think that's something that a lot of people are struggling to reconcile. So even when people are talking and sharing information that, oh, here's this anti-Black violence that's happening across Europe, especially for people that are trying to flee, who are people of color, Indigenous people trying to flee from these spaces, versus people who are racialized as white, who are fleeing from these spaces. So I'm curious, Bartholomew, and anyone else on the No White Saviors team as well, what are some practices that those of us that are recognizing these injustices can start to do in our own spaces, especially when it comes to engaging and encouraging the same type of community care that we're seeing people give to Ukrainians? How do we start doing that for the Black and Brown communities that are also fleeing violence in their communities?
Hi, Sydney. Can I say something? Sorry, my video is off. But on the refugee crisis that is currently happening, I would like to borrow from what Nancy Korita, she was the director for a non-profit here in Uganda. Unfortunately, she passed away during last year at the peak, at the start of the pandemic. She shares that we need local solutions to global problems. In that very article, she shares that oftentimes local people have been fast responders to problems affecting them as a country, to even problems affecting neighboring countries. To highlight that, she gave a scenario of what was happening in Sudan a few years ago and is still happening, and how so many refugees from Sudan were coming into Uganda. And at the time, they were settling in a place that wasn't really designated as a refugee camp. So her and her colleagues visited the place. They saw the kind of conditions these refugees were living in, and they felt something had to be done. They went into dialogue with local officials from that region in Acholi, Uganda, and also engaged other people from the government in Kampala. And through discussions, deliberations, a refugee camp was built, okay? But that's not how the story is, viewed or written about on international scenes or international media. It's usually when big NGOs come in that, or this NGO has helped, in the construction of a camp in such and such a region in Uganda for Sudanese refugees. It's never that no local people, local individuals engaged in humanitarian, work, saw the need first. Their voices are never highlighted when it reaches the international scene. So again, this is to say, I'm speaking from a Ugandan perspective. It's not that local people or communities are not doing things to help neighboring. It's just when local voices, local work meets the so-called international or global north or when they collide, the voices of the local people are overshadowed. They are not heard anymore. So they are really doing the work to help their own, again, from a Ugandan context. They're just overshadowed and othered in the whole process of the conversation. So yeah, but that shouldn't stop us from helping our own, even though our voices are not heard. At the end of the day, what matters is how we help each other as communities.
And I think you touched on something that was so important, that emphasis on local solutions, because one of the things that we don't often hear about, especially when the 5 minutes on NPR or one of the other stations that they give to talking about problems that are manifesting in African and Middle Eastern spaces. They are not talking to local organizers and community leaders who are actively on the ground engaging. They go and talk to their political science academics who are back in the United States or somewhere in Europe, or one of their correspondents who again has an outside perspective about a situation that is multi-generational and often is partly a product of settler colonialism and the exploitation of resources in these communities. So there's always this lack of a narrative, especially when it comes to on the ground work that's happening. And so I think that especially as we're going through this discussion, y'all will be hearing that a lot, us talking about local solutions and not necessarily us physically coming into these spaces, because those of us that do live in global North countries, going into spaces that our countries once upon a time had colonized and exploited and often still are exploiting, is not necessarily the solution. The solution is very localized. And so being able to support local efforts, I think, is definitely a start. And so one of the things that I know we here at the Anti-Racist Liberation and also with No White Saviors have been discussing is how to amplify those local efforts. And of course, there are GoFundMes and different Kickstarter campaigns, crowdfunding resources that have been manifesting across this world and across social media especially, but definitely when we think about humanitarian work, often our minds turn to giving money to the big organizations like UNICEF and these other international organizations that are funded and cultivated in the global North. So I'm curious, Wendy, and other team members as well, what are ways that we can kind of push beyond some of the larger organizations to find more of the local organizations, and so we can support them financially and support them in whatever ways that they're asking for support.
Hi, Sydney. Again, I would like to touch on the aspect of localization. I saw Sarah Nell gave a very good comment about localization. That's so true. Usually when NGOs are talking about localization or finding local solutions to global and local problems, they oftentimes tend to hire, let me give a story. For instance, I am Ugandan, born, raised in Uganda, lived my whole life in Uganda. And then you have a Ugandan that was born in the UK, has lived their whole life in the UK. They have a good degree, they're, smart people. And then in the process, they decide to come back home. Because in scenario, let's say Oxfam or War Child or any of those big NGOs are looking for a Ugandan to work for their country head or whatever, they are most likely going to pick the Ugandan that went to Oxford. So they're both Ugandans, but one does not have the lived experiences. So if we are talking about localization or finding local solutions to problem, we need to be wary of what our definition of localization is. Our understanding of the problems, is that the way the community understands them? When you say you're hiring a Ugandan, are you hiring a Ugandan with lived experiences? Are you hiring a Ugandan that is going to align themselves with the oppressive system that will keep quiet? Are you hiring a Ugandan out of tokenization? So yeah, I just thought I should share that.
And I appreciate you saying that. And again, thank you to everyone who is sharing their thoughts in the chat as well. Because again, we are all infected and affected by white supremacy. So again, when we talk about even localization, how is it that localization is also sometimes fueling this white supremacist system, rather than getting someone who is decolonized and is looking for reimagined local solutions, ancestral solutions, ancestral practices. You are looking for someone who is very much aligned with this white supremacist ecosystem. So someone who will basically be your mouthpiece. Yes, they might have the right look about them, or they're, oh, we pick somebody who's local. See, we're being intentional with our work, but you're not picking someone who is decolonized and someone who recognizes what's happening in the community. So again, I think that's something to keep in mind as well when we are looking out for these local organizations as well, to actually be thinking, is this local organization decolonized in their practices, and what actually are they trying to manifest in their communities? And again, this is the part of humanitarian work. Those of you that are engaged in the work, this touches a lot of your work, right? This is something that, especially in the last 2 years, I've been in some humanitarian spaces and they're saying, oh, well, we're trying to be more intentional. We're looking to have these 20-year plans on how we're going to reform and change our institutions. But again, it's important to ask the question, how are they actually changing their institutions, and are their practices decolonized? Because reform doesn't equate to decolonization, just as localization does not equate to decolonization. And Kelsey, I think you were going to chime in a minute earlier.
Really quickly, was just going to add on to what you and Wendy were so excellently saying, and there's been so many great comments in the chat. But I was also going to say, on the point of white folks, because that's my role on the team and in the work is, and it needs to be our role, is holding ourselves accountable and making anti-Blackness costly, not having these conversations in theory. And that's what No White Saviors, again, that's what we were birthed out of. It was, hey, I came in 12 years ago. I was 20 years old in the middle of undergrad at Temple University in Philly. And I came and volunteered as a short-term missionary for 3 months at an orphanage in Jinja. It does not get more white savior than that. So when we talk about, we would have these conversations increasingly over years with myself and Sharon, Olivia, who were both women. Sharon had started her own NGO and is still doing, I think her work has just gotten more incredible and more important over time. Local foster care, family preservation, basically working to make international adoption and orphanages obsolete. Now, Sharon is not going to get a New York Times bestseller like Katie Davis Majors, who wrote Kisses from Katie. We talked about that book. It's huge in the white evangelical community. And I think what we have to, I guess how I want to frame all of what I'm sharing with that is that we've had a lot of conversations for a really long time. We've had sessions like this, especially since 2020 and the Black Lives Matter uprising. We've seen an increased interest, right? And it's probably decreased now, it has, of that optical allyship, of that. But for things to really change and for us to really be about Indigenous local leadership and really trusting, not on the surface, which I think is a lot of what Sarah Nell's getting at, this whole, the INGOs with the localization process. It's a lot of like optical, we want to be looking like we do the right thing, but we actually don't want to give up power. And that's a very dangerous place to be. We can't be doing these things theoretically or abstractly. We have to tangibly be willing to put this into action, tangibly be willing to take risks. That means we might be risking our jobs. That means we might be risking our relationships with certain people, not recklessly, but it does call for progressively so when we understand how we benefit from the system of anti-Black racism and anti-Black violence, the more we're aware, the more we realize we're not ever doing enough. We're not ever going to be doing enough until the system is not there anymore. And so I think that's what it requires, is to actually know what is the risk and the cost, and know that it is what we owe. I'm speaking specifically to other white folks on the call. This is what we owe. It's not to make us a good white person or to pat ourselves on the back, but just to know it is a debt we are actively working to repay.
And you actually flowed us right into our second topic, which is about that performative activism and good white people. I cannot tell you, Kelsey, and I know we've talked about this before, but I still cannot tell you in the last 2 years, especially, how many posts I have made across social media where there is always one person or two people usually in the comments who immediately say, well, not this white woman, not this white man, I'm doing this, I'm challenging this. And I'm like, okay, but why did you have to say not this white person first? As if to say, I'm not a part of that. And of course, when we talk about performative activism, we're not just talking about the people who showed up at the marches and the parades and then went home afterwards, or have their signs displayed in their house in a nice picture frame to say, look, I was there, look at this beautiful sign I made. We're also talking about the people who, in conversation across social media, are very much involved in this public display of concern, this public display of activism. And of course, now there are activists who will say, you know, people who are changing their profile pictures to the flags of the country, or are saying, pray for this country or pray for this country, will challenge that and say that is a type of performative activism. But we're here more so to talk about people who are trying to say that performative language, the not this white person people, the people who are very much saying that, oh, well, I'm looking to be decolonized, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, good vibes. But at the same time, what are you actually doing? You can listen and listen and listen, you can sponge all of this information in, but how are you then manifesting that? So Kelsey, I know you got some thoughts on these not this white person and good white people.
Yeah, I mean, I've been that person and I can still be that person. Let's be honest. I think that's one of the things Sydney was talking to the team about when we, before we got on with you guys today, was how important it is to be able to make sure folks can ask questions, make comments. I think No White Saviors in particular, times we've gotten a reputation that we're just like very like aggressive, and we like don't know. It's honestly, you can really tell when someone genuinely has a question and when someone's just playing devil's advocate because they want to avoid responsibility or accountability. Chances are, if you're on this call, if you've this is not a required session that your workplace is making you attend, you are here because you want to be here. Chances are you're at least somewhere in the journey of confronting ego, right? And that's an area that just, if we do not confront how much of our defensiveness as white people and needing to portray ourselves as good white people, white saviors, whatever it is, right? It's not me, I'm not part of the problem. We just did a training session with a group from Belgium, and it was half of the group was Ugandan teachers, half of the group was Belgian teachers. And the defensiveness, there was not one white person in this group of people that was even open to listening. Everything was, how am I going to separate myself? How, the Belgian Congo and what Belgian did in Rwanda, and what, like, the violence of their past was not, they didn't see it as blood on their hands. They didn't acknowledge how they still benefit from it today. Why they happened to choose Uganda, that was a British colony, instead of two countries right next door to Uganda that their country has an incredibly violent past with. They didn't want, when I was using words like we, when I'm talking about us as white people, and I say we, the one woman, she's Italian, she asked me why I would use, the fact that I was using we was making her uncomfortable. Basically, she wanted to absolve me of my responsibility and absolve herself and probably all of her colleagues. That's what the good white person syndrome is. Look, we're here, we're in Uganda, we're working with Ugandan teachers, and we're collaborating. It's when we bring up proximity. I'm not racist. I have a biracial child, or I have a Black partner. I'm not racist. I have Black friends, or it's so dangerous because what it does is it says that if I do not even the bare minimum, and if proximity, like we put all of these conditions ourselves, we've decided as white people what makes us not racist, which is the first problem. And the second problem within that is that it really creates the space that there creates no room for growth, for real accountability, for real ownership of where our ancestors have caused violence and harm, how we're still benefiting from that harm and that violence today, and our responsibility to repair, make reparations, and make this system obsolete in the way that it needs to be. And so long as we are constantly trying to separate ourselves and say, not me, I'm not the racist, I don't benefit, these are all the ways that I'm a good white person, it really, it limits us completely from being able to engage honestly in the work that needs to be done. So if we're stuck at that place, that means we haven't done enough ego work. That means we haven't got honest enough with ourselves about how much we actually benefit from the system, even if we're doing some work in a Black community, even if we're donating to X number of, Black Lives Matter chapters or whatever qualifier we're using. It's never going to be enough until the system is gone. And I really think we need to understand that. So so I wanted to real quick, if I can, Sydney, it's a 30-second clip by Sister Soldier where she talks about how she's never met a good white person. Can I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Because she says it better than I could ever. So I think I can, yes, right here.
I think you have to share your audio.
Clearly I am,
I can see she's saying something, I'm like, oof.
So you can't hear her. How do you, wait. So okay, alternative. I will send it in the chat. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I will just send it in the chat because I obviously am, Rothomio is honestly the one that is way more tech savvy on our team. We probably rely way too heavily on him. And so I am always incapable, clearly, of being able to navigate basic Zoom etiquette. But anyway, Sydney, I wanted to pass it back over to you when it comes to the good white person syndrome and this need to constantly avoid accountability and the danger of optical allyship.
Oh yes, and I know there's a few people in the chat who are joining us from Scandinavian countries who were saying how in their respective countries, be it Norway, Finland, even Sweden, will say, oh, well, this doesn't really concern us because we didn't colonize, but I have been blocked by several European acquaintances over the years for saying this, but I will say it again. Every European country that had a king, a queen, an emperor, a prince regent, a duke, some person who wore a crown and rode on a horse was a part of colonization, whether their country actually was accepting enslaved people or whether they were just investing in these international slaving corporations with slave ships. All of these monarchies had a hand in the transatlantic slave trade. So when they say our countries have nothing to do with it, all of Europe has something to do with it because that's how Europe built their wealth across this transatlantic slave trade. There would not be an industrial revolution without the transatlantic slave trade. So again, when we talk about how we have to even reconcile our country's history, our international history of the global North, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about this multi-generational, multinational ecosystem that was built on the exploitation, the kidnapping, and the dehumanization of people from across Africa and across indigenous spaces in the Americas. Because we have to remember, indigenous people who were in North America, Central and South America were also taken over into African spaces and also into European spaces as well. So when we talk about, oh, our country didn't have anything to do with it, that was the British, that was the Portuguese, that was Spain. Nah, all of Europe has to reconcile this history, because when you, and I know this isn't an art history discussion and I'm no art historian, but I love looking at art. And so I've been to many a museum, and you see these Swedish kings, these Russian Caesars and czars who were posing with Black pages. And again, this was part of this ecosystem where they thought, oh, well, look how benevolent we are. We rescued this little African child, and they're not really enslaved. They're a servant and they have fancy clothes and they get to eat at our table and be our cupbearers. Look how wonderful and benevolent we are. So again, that's a part of this history as well. And when we think about how that plays into the, well, not this good white person. These European monarchs were the original, not this good white person, because they literally, their countries were exploiting these countries, but then they said, well, adopt one or two African children and exempt ourselves, because we don't have to reconcile that our countries are actively exploiting the countries where we've taken these children from. So again, there's this history of exploitation, and it's been covered up by humanitarian benevolence. And so when we talk about the fact that people are going into these African spaces, into these spaces across Central and South America, we have to remember that there is no humanitarian way to invade or exploit another country. I will say it again. There is no humanitarian way to invade or exploit another country. Because when we say not this white woman, or oop, not this Black man, because again, it ain't just white people. I have heard plenty of Black folks who are also like, well, no, this is just white people who do this mess. We don't have to ever like reconcile our own behavior if I'm doing service work as a Black person going into Africa, which is a roller coaster of a discussion to have with Black folks. But we have to remember that when we have those excuses, it allows for our community members to exempt themselves from any type of sustainable accountability or adjustments or interruptions of their system of reality. They don't have to check their worldviews, because in their minds, their good intentions are enough. But good intentions does not equate to good action. Your good intentions might be coming from a very kind, gentle place, but that could manifest as anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence, anti-queer violence. So when we talk about intentionality, you must go beyond that, because intentionality doesn't equate to good actions or good practices. And best practices does not equate to decolonized practices either, because there have been so many discussion places where we've been in where people will say, well, we want best practices, but best practices for who or whom, whatever the correct grammar is. But you know, when we talk about our practices, we really have to talk about what are the practices informed by? What are our day-to-day practices, our politics? What informs those politics? What informs those practices? So when we do that, what we realize is, oh, snap, a lot of our practices, a lot of our politics are informed by white supremacist ideologies, imperialist ideologies that are anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-queer, which then means we really have to challenge those systems. And like Kelsey had said earlier, that involves risk. Some of you who are in humanitarian work, in nonprofit work, might have to step away from those spaces. It involves actively challenging, and actively challenging is also actively walking away and telling them why you're walking away. I am walking away because we're involved in anti-Black practices and you all are not looking to change that. And I can't be a part of that. Kelsey, was there anything you wanted to add? I know people are dropping thoughts in the comments. Thank you all so much who are sharing your thoughts. This is all good food.
No, I mean, I just like, it's really good. It's encouraging to see people really engaging this. I think just the real stressor of understanding, like, I've had the serious honor of being mentored by different Black folks along the way, but that's the only reason I know what I know now. And so none of us as white people ever wake up and understand this. That's why someone like Robin DiAngelo is so dangerous. For many reasons. She's also a millionaire off of Black and Indigenous knowledge, right? So, but you don't have to turn into Robin DiAngelo to get it right. And the real truth is none of us are going to get it right 100% of the time. We have to be willing to show up. It's going to be messy. It's going to be difficult. But if we are challenging and confronting our egos, then we are going to really be able to participate in what looks like actual repair, actual accountability, actual way forward. That doesn't mean you're not going to mess up, but when we mess up, what is our response? Defensiveness still creeps up for me. I still find myself wanting to be that good white person. So when I bring that up, I'm not talking about it to every other white person on this call like I'm some evolved version of whiteness. No, we are indoctrinated with this stuff every day. So it's a death to ego, death to pride, death to the reputation of what white people have been trying, what we've been trying to maintain, this lie for so long. And it's really an invitation, which Black folks have been giving us. I was just listening to Baldwin's Cambridge. It was a debate. It wasn't really a debate. The other man wasn't even close to being able to debate James Baldwin. But when James Baldwin in that debate or speech he gave, I really encourage folks to listen because he's really inviting white people back to our humanity. It's not the only premise of the debate, but in a room full of predominantly white people in the 60s, he was really inviting that room full of white people to say, look, you're suffering under white supremacy too. What is the trauma that happens time after time when these systems that your ancestors created that you still benefit from, what is that like? Just as there is trauma, generational trauma for Black folks and descendants of colonialism and slavery, there is a different kind of trauma for white people. Why do you think almost all of the mass shooters are white men? That's not an accident. There's some deep-rooted psychosis and trauma going on being passed through generations. And if we want to break that, we have to start getting honest about what we've done and what's going on now, and then pave the way forward to do better, because the risks that are being taken are almost always Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color. It's not nearly enough white folks that are willing to tell the truth and risk what is required of us to do so. So that's my challenge and my, I think what we need to require.
Absolutely. And I think, again, this is something that a lot of people struggle to reconcile because the philosophy of white supremacy, there is a lot of safety in that. And I think that's the thing that is difficult for people to have to reconcile. That safety is built on a lie. And that lie is that white identities, cultures, politics, economic systems, gender identities, all of that is superior to everything that is labeled as non-white. And really what James Baldwin did in that speech, what Black and Brown people have been trying to do and have been actively doing for generations, is telling white folks and people who align themselves with whiteness, because again, it's not just white folks. There are many near white people who very much want to die on that hill, on that pedestal of whiteness. They've been telling these people that you can come back and join the community of humanity. It's safe here. There's actual safety in community. Whiteness is built on rugged individualism, on I have to take care of mine own and I don't have to care about anyone else until I make a decision to care about someone else. And again, that is, like Kelsey said, it is very much built upon ego. Whiteness is a very slim pedestal, which is very easy to fall off. And they will do everything in their power to convince you that if you fall off, you will die. But what we have to realize is that pedestal, first of all, was not built for anyone except a handful of white, mostly heterosexual, landowning white men. And if you are not part of that little group, that pedestal wasn't built for you. And even that little group, it's hurting them as well, because they have decided to disengage themselves from the rest of humanity. Whiteness is something that is very harmful to all of us. And it hurts white people the most, because you build your identity on a false biomythology. To borrow a word from Audre Lorde, a biomythology is when you cultivate your identity around memories, around different words, and all of the words and memories and lived experiences that you are cultivating are through a lens of whiteness. And again, this isn't something that just harms white people, it harms all of us. So that's what we're here to discuss. As far as humanitarian aid goes, again, it goes all the way back to that original philosophy. And that actually goes right into our third topic, which is about communal wellness. When we talk about humanitarian aid, and the reason a lot of us are called to these humanitarian spaces, to these nonprofit and some cases for-profit work, is because of this idea of community. And when we, and I think back to when I was younger in college, a lot of the times I did volunteer work, and I was fortunate enough to go to my father's ancestral country of Ghana to do a service trip. But even while I was there, in the midst of the service trip, I started noticing some rhythms that were very much rooted in whiteness that I was doing. This idea of, oh, well, if these kids came over to the United States to go to school, oh, they'd have so much more opportunities. Or if I was, if I wasn't in college, if I was an adult and had income and whatnot, oh, I would adopt this child and this child and this child. And again, I had to kind of pause and say, oh my God, what the hell am I doing? Why am I saying these things? And again, all of that was rooted in whiteness. So again, it's not just something the white folk got to work on. We all got to work on it, because there are a number of organizations and student missions who still market their programs as service trips. And those service trips allow for participants to work closely with communities across the global South, while also kind of vacationing at the same time. And so it's like this vacation tourism that has been manifesting in these spaces. And this humanitarian tourism also kind of cultivates this false narrative around these vulnerable populations and these communities. And in a lot of ways, again, whether it's their intention or not, they are exploiting and commodifying people by saying, hey, let's go over to Uganda, let's go over to Ghana, to South Africa, to Ethiopia, to Bolivia or Colombia, and drop you all off for 3 weeks so that you can immerse yourselves in the cultures and take pictures and show everybody what a good humanitarian worker you are. And then you go back home to your global North community to share this story and say, oh, I loved it there. Like, there's so many layers that are problematic with the way we've cultivated service work and service trips, especially for student activists, young people who are going into communities, first of all, who do not understand the cultures they're going into, do not understand the history of these communities, many which are still struggling with colonized ideologies and practices and politics, and are looking at them and saying, oh, well, I have so much, now it is my responsibility to take care of them. And again, this cultivates this paternalism idea that was very popular in the United States and across Europe back during the height of colonization, that, oh, well, we as good white people and as good people, good Christians, we are going to go into these communities that we are actively exploiting and exploit them some more, but in a humanitarian way now. And of course, those of us that are in humanitarian work don't look at the work that we're doing as exploitative. We look at it as being very helpful and very intentional. But a lot of this service work has rhythms and roots that are still very much aligned with whiteness. And so I'm curious from the No White Saviors team, not only what are some of those roots that you've noticed, but also what are the ways that now that we've recognized it, we start to uproot that from our work. And again, in some cases, that means walking away from these places, walking away from these systems. But what are some other ways that we can also engage?
Hi, Sydney. Wendy
Oh, go ahead.
here. Kelsey, go ahead, please.
No, Wendy, please go.
On what you've shared, Sydney, there is a very interesting article by Martin E. Cox called "Western Do-Gooders Need to Resist the Allure of Exotic Problems." It's a very well-written article, pretty much summarizes volunteering and volunteerism. But to borrow from what Paulo writes in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, especially about solidarity, about individuals from predominantly white countries that feel the need, I don't know if it's really the need to be in solidarity with marginalized communities, but if at all you do find yourself in that position as an individual that is racialized as white, what does solidarity look like with marginalized communities? Paulo highlights that the oppressors may, according to history, time and time again, they've joined forces with the oppressed. But it's very important in how they come into spaces of the marginalized. Are they coming in as, the ones that know everything, the ones with the means to the ends, the ones that, are the sole providers of knowledge, or are they coming in to work with, to be in solidarity with the oppressed, to be in solidarity with the marginalized? As long as you are coming into these communities, whether on service trips or they could be long-term or short-term, with the mindset that you are there to reason and think for these communities, that's not justice, that's not liberation. It is important that as you are coming into these communities, that as you are going into solidarity with these communities, you're aware that these communities are communities of individuals that reason, that know their problems and know how best to solve their problems. You're therefore coming into these communities to work with the communities, not to work for them. Yeah, that's all I heard.
Yeah, I think we can move on. Just for the sake of time, I want to make sure we can get to this, the last section. Do you think that's okay for us to? I was looking at the time. I'm usually the one that has no clue with the time. Wendy's like, she'll text us in the back channels and be like, guys, we're going over, we're not going to fit everything in. So I think if we can move on to Wendy, and I know that you're also going to be adding in a lot of value to it, Sydney, for this last section. And then I think we've been getting a lot of questions throughout, but I know we also want to leave some room for some questions at the end.
Absolutely. And so I know that, especially when we talk about humanitarian work, I know all of you who have stepped into this space, again, you weren't attached to any equity program or any organization saying that, okay, this is a mandatory training. All of you voluntarily came into the space with us. But again, this is a space that is very challenging. It's a space that challenges you to interrupt and disrupt, actively disrupt your system of reality, and recognizing how our systems are infected and affected by whiteness, and that this isn't something that is going to be fixed tomorrow or when you wake up. This is something that is part of a lifelong process. This is what we like to call slow growth activism. This is something that you are planting seeds and cultivating throughout the rest of your life, because whiteness bombards us on a day-to-day basis. That is how effective it is. And it's something that is very evolutionary. It evolves in different environments. So this is something that you will have to be actively engaged in for the rest of your life, which sounds a little daunting, but also realize, again, with this communal wellness, is that you don't have to walk it alone. And when we talk about in the global north, how there are many activists who recognize that there's some benevolent racism and some ethical dilemmas that manifest from community service projects, similar to those of you that are in the United States are probably familiar with Teach for America, for example, but across the world, Oxford and all of these other organizations that continue to use community members as props, especially children in the global south, in photographs and social media posts and their personal stories. We have to recognize that this is another tool of whiteness. And it's something that I had to go and reconcile after I took my trip to Ghana, of how I was using pictures of children. And in some ways, in my undergrad mind, I was like, oh, I had friendships with these kids and I wanted to share those pictures with my family. But then I also put them on social media, and I was showcasing children and, in a sense, using them as props, because then I was praised for, wow, you did this amazing thing. Wow, you went into this country and you were helping these children for the few weeks that I was there. And we have to really, first and foremost, acknowledge that the humanity of people across the global south is neither ours to commodify or is ours to own. And when we're doing this work, we cannot be going into these spaces, similar to what Wendy said. We can't be going into these spaces with the intent to enlighten, with the intent to save, with the intent to teach them, because what we don't when we go in with those assumptions and with those ideas in our mind, we are going in with a white supremacist ideology, because we are attached to those systems, being citizens and community members that are coming from countries that are a part of the global north. Whether or not we think our countries were involved with colonization, our countries were involved with colonization. So what does it look like to be from a country that has colonized another country, and to go into those countries and say, well, I'm here to save you? Again, there is no humanitarian way to invade or exploit another country. What we're doing is a softer version of colonization. So when we talk about our service work, we have to remember that we have to engage it in that respect. We have to be thinking about it in the sense that we understand our role, and our role often should not be to be the leader. Our role is to ask, what can I do to help? And then to listen. And sometimes the answer might not be one that we want to hear, but they might say, we don't need you. And we have to be willing to accept that answer as well. And I know that's part of my closing reflections. No White Saviors team, did you all have any final thoughts?
Hi, Sydney. Well, a personal thought, not entirely reflective of the team, is that on being, because like we all know, oppression is very intersectional, privilege is very intersectional. So on being in solidarity with people, for instance, myself, Wendy, a bit educated as compared, to my mom, but also I'm questioning what do we mean by education in how I approach my mom or any other person that may not be at the level where I am. I need to be wary of how I come off. Am I speaking for them? Okay. Am I the sole producer of knowledge? We need to question the way we stand up for people who we quote unquote call marginalized, because how we stand up for them or stand up with them would really show what we are all about at the end of the day. So questioning our intent time and time again as we are fighting oppressive systems. You may not have privilege in a certain context, but you may find yourself with privilege in another context. So how do you react when you're in a position where you're privileged? It's really very important if we are talking about Black liberation and any kind of liberation.
I think there's only one thing I wanted to add, is like after that, just being very intentional about like basically going off of what Wendy's saying about the effectiveness. If we are just talking in echo chambers, and we have, not that this is an echo chamber, right? Because we all have very different lived experiences, different ideas, different probably ideas of how we get from where we're at to where hopefully all of us want to go in terms of liberation and justice. But we can get stuck a lot in the conversation phase. And I think that's something we talked to Sydney about, is what does it look like tangibly to put this into action? And so a lot of times we know one of the discussions that comes up a lot is like, how do you change this from within versus is it even possible to change from within? We brought mention of, Sydney, you mentioned reform. Reform is not abolition. It is not going to be decolonial. It's going to just make minor changes that look like it's trying to go in the right direction. They're going to bring no white saviors in, they might even bring no white saviors in. A lot of NGOs, Sarah Nell can attest to this, NGOs will bring us in, but when it comes to actually being willing to make the changes, that's another conversation. And so for us, I mean, that's why no white saviors existed, because we were not seeing an ability to change it from within. I'm sharing that because I'm not saying go start another no white saviors necessarily. I'm saying we have to start getting creative, right? Because white supremacy has become very creative, very sophisticated over time. Sydney used the word evolution. It's become more and more evolved. So right when now we have NGOs, foreign aid, we have obviously the military industrial complex. We create proxy wars and pseudo wars. So we have a reason to have military presence in just so happens to be areas of the world that have a lot of minerals that we want. And so when it comes to actually changing things, can we change it from within the NGO sector, from within? Well, when we understand that these systems, just like policing, were not made to ever be changed, and we're actually made to be inherently anti-Black, inherently colonial and imperialistic in nature, my personal belief is no, we cannot change it from within, because there's too much invested and too much money being made off of the maintenance of these systems and institutions that perpetuate anti-Blackness and imperialism. So that does call for creativity of how do we start challenging this from outside? Maybe it's through journalism, maybe it's writing articles and starting. I didn't know this until a few years ago. My friend Caleb, he's a Nigerian journalist here. He's like, hey, you want to write this piece? We wrote a piece about COVID and how it was being talked about on the African continent. They were projecting mass death here, and it was actually the place in the world, the whole continent was doing better than any other continent. And I co-wrote a piece in Al Jazeera with him. And so I didn't know that anyone could, I didn't go to school for journalism, but you can pitch articles to news media. You could start a podcast if you're into that. There's those examples, but there's different avenues. It's looking at how is white supremacy in this area of how I know I could actually affect change. how is this still what it is today? And what could I be a part of that's already in existence? Or what could I create that would actually be something that could bring about strategic resistance and tangible change?
Did any of the other team members have any final thoughts? I know in the chat, again, those of you that have been engaging, thank you so much. You all have given us a lot to think about as we've been engaging. Oh, I actually think I saw a question mark somewhere in the chat. Oh, so someone had asked, does anyone have favored resources around decolonizing humanitarian work? No White Saviors team who know all things about resource sharing. Do you all have any resources that you have been utilizing?
Why did I know Sarah Nell would have a resource? Sarah Nell needs to help lead this next session.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, we just have so much love for her. She's doing really important work, so she probably can't talk too much about it, but just know Sarah Nell is a revolutionary and we need her to be where she's at doing what she does.
Oh, and there was another question as well. The question is, we always say we make money from anti-Blackness, but then I heard that Europe pumps billions each year into prison camps in Libya, Sudan, etc. I have also seen a few articles that talk about, I think it was specifically Britain that was doing some mass incarceration work in a few places. Sudan was one of them. And again, that is part of anti-Blackness. So it's not something that's just happening in the United States. It's something that has manifested across these spaces. So mass incarceration, again, when we think about how is law enforcement used not to protect and serve people, but to reinforce white supremacist structures. And not only that, but to legitimize those white supremacist structures, how militaries are used. And again, we look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, where there is a lot of support towards military action, whether that's sending money for military resources or talking about sending personnel or sending weapons. But we don't see that same care being taken into our African spaces, in particular, because those African spaces have resources that these countries want to exploit and cultivate and commodify, whether those are people or whether that's natural resources. But when we talk about how mass incarceration is a big money industry, some of you might be familiar with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is specifically talking about mass incarceration in the United States, but that template is cultivated all over the global North. So what she was talking about in the United States is not unique to the US. It is something that people are talking about in Britain and France. And again, how these countries aren't just cultivating mass incarceration and anti-Black violence in their own countries, but also they're reinforcing it across African spaces, Middle Eastern spaces as well. Did anyone on the No White Saviors team want to add any thoughts on that? All right, well, if no one has any final thoughts, I did want to thank all of you for joining us in the space today. And before you log off to go to bed or to wake up, because I know it's morning, nighttime, all the times, time is relative. I don't know how time zones work. Still trying to figure it out. But I would like to thank all of you for coming into this space with us. Those of you that are familiar with the work that No White Saviors does, whether it's on social media, whether you're following posts they've made, highly encourage you to continue to support their work as well, and to support the work that we're doing here in our collaborative spaces. We will be having our second portion on 2 Sundays from now, on March 27th. We will be getting into missionary work, which those of you that know No White Saviors or know the Anti-Racist Liberation, you already know how we're going to talk about it, but we're going to get into the meat and green things of how missionary work is one of the driving forces in anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-queer work that is rippling across the global South and also in the global North as well. So as we engage with those spaces, we encourage all of you to join us again for that second portion. Thank you for joining us today, and I wish all of you a safe day, a safe night, a safe morning, and just a safe week as you go forward.